When the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, was founded in 1949, it was not conceived as a sovereign state in the same sense as West Germany. Instead, it emerged as a product of Soviet power in occupied Europe. Its leadership, its institutions, and even its existence were bound to Moscow's will. The paradox of East Germany was that it trusted Moscow far more than its own fellow Germans in Berlin, and this was no accident. It was the result of war, occupation, ideology, and the fragile legitimacy of the state itself. The roots of this trust begin in 1945. Germany lay in ruins, divided into occupation zones controlled by the victorious Allies. The Soviets, who had lost more than 20 million people in the war, demanded security above all else. Their vision for their occupation zone in eastern Germany was not to build a democratic partner, but to ensure a loyal buffer against the West. That meant creating a political order tied directly to Moscow. For many Germans in the eastern zone, trust in their Soviet overseers was not born of affection, but necessity. Berlin, the old capital, was associated with the Nazi regime that had destroyed Europe and brought catastrophe upon Germany. Moscow, in contrast, represented survival, reconstruction, and a new order, at least as it was presented through propaganda. By 1946, the Soviets engineered the forced merger of the Communist Party of Germany, KPD, and the Social Democratic Party, SPD, in their zone, creating the Socialist Unity Party, SED. This merger was deeply unpopular. Many Social Democrats resisted, remembering that communists had often been their rivals in the Weimar era, but Moscow insisted. The new SED leadership, including figures like Walter Ulbricht, owed their positions to Stalin's blessing. Their loyalty was not to Berlin or to the German people, but to the Kremlin. In fact, Ulbricht himself had spent the Nazi years in Moscow, surviving the purges, and was parachuted back into Germany by Soviet authorities. To him and his colleagues, Moscow was not merely an ally, it was the guarantor of their survival. East Germany's dependence deepened with the events of 1948 to 49. The Berlin blockade, in which the Soviets attempted to starve West Berlin into submission, hardened the division of Germany. When the blockade failed, the Soviets doubled down on building a loyal satellite in the east. The founding of the GDR in October 1949 came directly after the creation of the Federal Republic of Germany in the west. From the very beginning, East Germany was the weaker of the two Germanys. It lacked legitimacy in the eyes of many of its citizens, millions of whom fled westward in the early years. In this fragile situation, trust in Moscow was not optional, it was existential. Without Soviet military and economic backing, the GDR would have collapsed before it even took root. This reliance became brutally clear in June 1953. Widespread protests and strikes erupted in East Germany, triggered by increased work quotas and poor living conditions. Workers took to the streets demanding not just economic relief, but also political freedom. The East German leadership panicked. Ulbricht and his colleagues knew they could not control the situation alone. They turned to Moscow. It was Soviet tanks and Soviet troops that crushed the uprising, killing dozens and arresting thousands. From that moment, it was unmistakable. The survival of the East German state depended entirely on the Soviet Union. The SED leadership learned a clear lesson: they could not trust their own people in Berlin, Leipzig, or Dresden. They could only trust Moscow to keep them in power. The construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961 reinforced this reality. Between 1949 and 1961, more than 2.7 million East Germans fled to the west, many through Berlin. This exodus threatened to destroy the GDR's labor force and credibility. Ulbricht famously declared that no one has the intention of building a wall, but with Moscow's approval, the barbed wire went up overnight in August 1961, later replaced by concrete. The wall was both a symbol of East German weakness and of Soviet support. Once again, the East German regime could not solve its problems through trust in Berlin or its citizens. It relied entirely on Moscow's strategic decision to seal the border and maintain the division. The ideological factor was just as important as the military one. The GDR defined itself as the first socialist state on German soil. Its identity was rooted not in the traditions of German nationalism, but in Marxism-Leninism imported from the Soviet Union. School curricula, propaganda, and political culture glorified the Soviet experience. Streets were named after Soviet heroes, children learned Russian in schools, and monuments to Red Army soldiers stood in the heart of East German cities. By contrast, Berlin, as the seat of old German nationalism or liberal democracy, was portrayed as tainted, compromised, or dangerous. Trust in Moscow was cultivated not just as a political necessity, but as an ideological virtue. Yet this trust was not equal or reciprocal. East Germany's leadership trusted Moscow because it had no other choice. The Soviets, for their part, never fully trusted the East Germans. Stalin had little confidence in Ulbricht, but he saw him as loyal. Later, under Khrushchev and Brezhnev, Moscow continued continued to view East Germany as a satellite rather than a partner. The 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia demonstrated what happened to any socialist state that tried to chart its own course. East Germany learned the lesson well. Its survival depended on conformity to Soviet will. Even during the 1970s, when West Germany under Willy Brandt pursued Ostpolitik and normalized relations with the East, the GDR remained bound to Moscow. Brandt's recognition of East Germany gave it international legitimacy, but internally, the SED leadership feared that contact with the West would undermine its authority. Once again, they leaned on Moscow to shield them from the dangers of German-German dialogue. Trust in Moscow remained stronger than trust in Berlin, even when Berlin meant their own divided city. By the 1980s, this dependency began to crack. Gorbachev's reforms in the Soviet Union glasnost and perestroika created panic in East Berlin. Ulbricht's successor, Erich Honecker, did not want reform. He wanted the old guarantees of Soviet backing, but Moscow under Gorbachev no longer promised unconditional support. When protests spread in East Germany in 1989, the regime appealed again to Moscow. This time, the answer was different. Soviet tanks would not roll in. Without Moscow's protection, East Germany collapsed almost overnight. The irony was bitter. For 40 years, the regime had trusted Moscow more than Berlin. In the end, Moscow abandoned it, and Berlin, once divided, became the center of a reunified Germany. The story of East Germany's trust in Moscow is therefore not a tale of affection or shared destiny. It is a story of weakness, survival, and dependency. East Germany's leaders distrusted their own citizens and their own capital far more than they distrusted the Kremlin. For them, Moscow was not just a patron. It was the only foundation upon which their state rested, and when that foundation crumbled, the GDR vanished with it.